Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I want to start by acknowledging the sadness that we all carry with us here tonight at the passing of of the late Bob Zimmer, our most recent past president. This is exactly the kind of event that Bob would have loved, and he would have been sitting here in the front row listening to this conversation and this dialogue tonight about serious topics backed up by real data, and we are going to miss his presence here very much tonight and in our community going forward. Our condolences go out tonight to Shadi and their children. But we carry on. My name is Nick Epley. I'm a professor of behavioral science here at the University of Chicago. I'm the faculty director of the Roman Family Center for Decision Research. I want to welcome you tonight to this event, the speaker series that we call Think Better. This is a public lecture series that's meant to highlight how behavioral science is being used out in the world to influence public policy, influence society in ways that try to make the world better. This is our last talk of this academic year. We will resume again next year in the fall, bringing Betsy Levy-Pallack from Princeton University to us on November 15th, David Brooks from the New York Times on April 3rd, and our former Dean of Social Sciences here at the University of Chicago, Mario Small, who's a professor now at Columbia University, will be with us on May 1st. Also next fall, on October 29th, I believe, we'll be partnering with WBEZ and NPR's Science Friday for a live event with Ira Flatow. He and I will be talking about social connection. We will be downtown at the Studebaker Theater, not far from our MindWorks location at 224 South Michigan. We hope you'll join us for that. If you're on the newsletter, you'll get announcements about these. We also hope, as the summer's coming up, that you'll join us downtown at MindWorks. This is our public-facing Discovery Center for Behavioral Science. It's fun, it's free, it's air-conditioned, and we give out lots and lots of swag, so we hope to see you there this summer. Tonight, though, what we're going to be doing in this last talk of the year is we're going to be doing a little bit of eavesdropping. And who doesn't like to do some eavesdropping? This conversation tonight that we're going to have between our two speakers, Richard Thaler and Steve Pinker, was actually inspired by a series of conversations that they had a few years ago when they were both at Berkeley. And they got together with their families, enjoyed the conversation so much, we thought, hey, we can do that again here, except we will all listen in. There's no food, there's no family, there's no wine, and they're all mic'd up so we can listen. So it's a little different than what they actually did there, but nevertheless, it should be very cool. We get to listen in on the conversation between two of the most influential minds in the behavioral sciences in the last half century. And what they're going to talk about tonight is rationality. Steve Pinker is the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, one of the field's brightest minds and broadest thinkers, whose latest book, Rationality, tries to describe what rationality is, why it seems in such short supply, and why it matters. Steve comes to the topic of rationality as an evolutionary psychologist, trying to understand how the forces of evolutionary history allow us to reason about the world, kind of building up from a groundwork of almost nothing. Richard Thaler is our colleague here at the University of Chicago in the Booth School, serving as the Charles Walgreen Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science, and he's the 2017 recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, and he comes to the topic of rationality as an economist, knowing full well the limitations that we as normal human beings have that keep us from reasoning quite as brilliantly as economists would presume standard models of rationality would presume human beings are able to reason. So how should we think about rationality? Are our brains half full or are they half empty? On the one hand, we managed to seem quite brilliant in lots of ways. We've sent people to the moon, sequenced the genome, created artificial intelligence, figured out how to make fine wine. That's all pretty good stuff. That's pretty smart. We seem pretty sharp. On the other hand, we invent crazy conspiracy theories about our trips to the moon, had trouble sequencing our meetings that are going to come up next week, forget every bit of ninth grade algebra that we learned when we're trying to teach our kids how to do it. On the other hand, we maybe don't seem so bright at all. At times, I think everybody can resonate a little bit with Larry Summers' opening quote on a paper he wrote about rationality in financial markets, where he said, "There are idiots, look around." So how do we make sense of all this? How do we characterize human rationality? Are we savants or are we idiots? I think a lot of times our conversations about rationality are a little bit like Alanis Morissette's use of the word ironic. Which sounds good until you think about it carefully. That doesn't sound so great after all. It's a little bit confusing. But tonight we're going to get some clarity. Tonight we're going to get some clarity on these issues from two of the big, most influential minds on this topic. This is the way this is going to work tonight. What we have done is we have gathered questions from all of you, assembled them as best we can. Richard has thrown in a few questions on his own, wild card questions that he's going to pop every now and then to Steve and see how it goes, and we are just going to listen in. We will end at about the hour mark because they do actually have actual dinner reservations after this, and I will not keep them late for that. So please, everybody, enjoy tonight's conversation between Richard and Steve, and I want to thank them both for coming. They can come on out now. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks to all of you for coming. We can't see all of you, but we can see that you're there. Thanks, Steve, for coming. Let me explain a little bit about how this event happened. About a year ago, after Steve wrote his most recent book called Rationality, we realized we were both in Berkeley and got together for a very long coffee and talked about his book. And I'll give a slight bit of background about rationality is a topic we're both interested in. And the title we announced for this is Rationality Half Full or Half Empty. I should admit it could be both. And 30 years ago, I wrote a book, academic book called Quasi-Rational Economics. Steve's book is just called Rationality. So there's no quasi. And the thing that Steve and I were trying to talk about is, do we really disagree about anything? So we had fun talking about that. Let me set out right from the beginning that at some point in the book, Steve says his own position on rationality is, I'm for it. So am I. I think we're done. So just to get us started, Steve, why don't you tell us briefly what the premise of that book is and why you wrote it and why you wrote it now, and
Sure.
That'll get us started.
So the subtitle is what it is, why it seems scarce, why it matters. So what it is, like many social scientists, I think that the tools that we use in our everyday work and that we use as a benchmark of rationality against which we compare human thinking. Normative models like probability, logic, correlation and causation, game theory, rational choice theory, don't come naturally to people, at least not when they're expressed, are available overtly as explicit cognitive tools, and that every educated person really should know what it means to engage in Bayesian reasoning, or the basic stance behind game theory, or how to tell correlation from causation. I, years ago, lobbied unsuccessfully at Harvard for this to be part of our undergraduate requirement, that everyone master these cognitive tools. I lost. It was actually killed by the mathematicians. Another story. But I decided then to teach a course that would, one chunk of which would be just a conceptual introduction to these 7 tools of reasoning. But when I told people, and as a psychologist, I'm not a statistician, I'm not a logician, but of course these set the stage for asking the question, how rational is a typical member of Homo sapiens? And to frame the question, we in our field typically compare human performance against these normative models which serve as benchmarks. This is what it would be to be rational. What do actual humans do? When I told people I was teaching a course on rationality, the question that I got was not, oh, great, how can I be like more of a Bayesian in thinking? The question was, okay, how do you explain QAnon? And and crystal healing power and vaccine resistance. And I realized I couldn't avoid the question of the more flamboyant disavowals of reason, or so it would seem, which actually have gotten less attention in the literature in cognitive psychology, judgment, decision-making, behavioral economics, than some of our chestnuts like the gambler's fallacy and base rate neglect and sunk cost. Why those parts of our curriculum don't really help a lot in explaining why people believe in QAnon. So I realized I would have to take that on in this course as one of the topics. Then the pandemic happened. I put my lectures online. They started to get widespread interest beyond the university, and I was persuaded that had to be the topic of my next book. Finally, why it matters. It may seem kind of gratuitous to say that you're in favor of rationality, and I argue it is gratuitous, but nonetheless the case needs to be made, not just that we ought to try to overcome our shortcomings, but that since we're in an age in which social justice is on everyone's minds, I ended the book by arguing that many of the, perhaps all of the great social justice movements originated with a rational argument, that there is no tension between rationality and social justice. On the contrary, the first activists for democracy as opposed to absolute monarchy, for the abolition of slavery, the abolition of cruel and unusual punishments, women's rights, gay rights, those activists tried to show how practices of the day were inconsistent with values that people claimed to hold and advanced the cause with that initial spark of rationality.
Okay, so in the opening chapter of this book, Steve goes through a bunch of what might be called the greatest hits of judgment and decision-making research. And I'm guessing that this audience knows many of them. If I mention Linda, the feminist bank teller, how many of you know who I'm talking about? What about a bat and a ball? Okay. So there's discussion of all of those characters. Linda is I feel like I know her, and Stephen Jay Gould, the famous biologist and popular science writer, has a great line about it that Steve quotes. Stephen Jay Gould says, "I know the feminist bank teller is less likely than a bank teller, but a little homunculus in my head continues to jump up and down, shouting at me, 'She can't be a bank teller, read the description.'" So, and there are many other versions of that particular fallacy, the conjunction fallacy. People think floods caused by earthquakes are more likely than floods, and so forth. So I don't need to tell you, Steve's a great writer. He has this line, "Tell people there's an invisible man in the sky who created the universe, and the vast majority will believe you. Tell them that the paint is wet and they still have to touch it to be sure."
Although credit for that goes to George Carlin. I use that as an epigraph.
I see, okay. Well, I attribute it to you, but George Carlin is funny. Was funny. So in spite of that, you kind of, sort of want to argue that there is rationality. We agree there should be.
Yeah.
But I think, and this is the discussion we started with a year ago, I think you think that people, this is reminiscent of the talk you gave this morning about common knowledge, I think you think that I think people are dumber than you think.
I follow that.
Is that right? Or
Well, neither of us picked the title of tonight's events, Glass Half Full, Half Empty.
I did.
Oh, you did? Okay, very good. I take that back. So maybe it is a description rather than an assessment of how full the glass is. But I do tend, in the book, in contrast to a number of the bestsellers coming out of the literature on behavioral economics and judgment and decision-making and heuristics and fallacies and biases, many of which emphasize how irrational humans are. Perhaps the most blatant was Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational. I did want to kind of underscore the ways in which we really are rational. And one of them is, how do we even assess rationality or irrationality unless we could grasp some benchmark of rationality, normative models, against which we can compare all those schnooks who make those fallacies. So you and I claim to be capable of understanding where the fallacy is in the sunk cost fallacy and the Linda fallacy and so on. Well, you and I are people. We're not, Martians. We're not angels. We're not some superior breed. And so it suggests that everyone can be certainly made aware of what is rational, and we wouldn't even be able to frame the question of when are people rational or irrational unless we had some conception of what rationality is in the first place. There's that. There's also the, even though I am in many ways an evolutionary psychologist, I always recoiled against the common trope of attributing human irrationality to our ancestors on the savannah, the hunter-gatherers, who, according to the stereotype, always had to be wary of a rustle in the grass that might be a lion that might eat them, and so we react quickly and reflexively and without thinking things through, and that's why we misjudge risk. Studies of actual hunter-gatherers, which is how I begin the book,
yes,
by the son of the Kalahari, are highly cerebral, rational planners and decision makers. They have to be because for humans to have taken over the planet, which we did before civilization, not because we were stronger or swifter or had more toxic poisons than other animals and plants, but because we outsmarted them. And one of the ways in which we, meaning our ancestors, and one of the ways in which hunter-gatherers outsmarted animals was by tracking them. So you can't, if you live in the Kalahari Desert, you can't outrun an antelope. They're way, way faster. On the other hand, they are furry, and they heat up quickly, and they can only run in bursts. Humans are naked, so we can sweat and dump heat. We're also vertical instead of horizontal, so less sun shines on us. So our built-in advantage as hunters is pursuit hunting. We can kind of run a marathon and keep pursuing an animal until it keels over of heat stroke and then kind of bash it on the head or stick a spear through it. But that only works since they will dart out of sight really quickly if you can track them, that is, predict where they have gone based on their tracks, which involves long chains of inference. What is the condition of the animal? What is the species? What is the sex? What is he likely to do? They engage in critical reasoning. They argue with each other. They question evidence. They engage in Bayesian reasoning. If the evidence is ambiguous, they'll go with the more plentiful animal in that environment. So one of my arguments is to the extent that people are irrational, don't blame the hunter-gatherers. And by extension, don't assume that human nature in its natural state is just a bunch of instinctive gut feelings and reflexes. We evolved as cerebral, cognitive, deliberative creatures, to the extent that contemporary hunter-gatherers offer a window into our evolutionary past. And the third thing that I emphasize, which I think a number of the predecessor books on rationality don't, is kind of backlash within the literature of people who have questioned whether the normative models that the many cognitive psychologists and behavioral economists have held out as the ground truth, the gold standard, what rationality actually would consist of. They said, well, actually, it's not so clear that what you're calling the rational decision is the rational decision, and maybe those boobs who come into the lab and appear to be irrational actually are conforming to a different normative model that is more applicable in that particular circumstance, given the way you've set up the experiment. Probably the most outspoken, but not the only one, is someone, I think, Richard, one of your bête noire is Gerd Gigerenzer, who has pushed back for many decades against the standard Tversky and Kahneman line of humans as being pretty inherently irrational, showing that a lot of the so-called errors really aren't necessarily errors. And to go back to the Linda problem, the question, is it more likely, so there's, just for those few of you who may not have be familiar with the problem, you give a stereotype of a social justice warrior, a very smart activist woman, and then the money question is it more likely that she's a bank teller or a feminist bank teller? Now, it turns out that the word likely or probable, what it means is not so clear. Actually, there are several distinct meanings in the literature on the philosophy of probability, and among them are relative frequency. Of 100 people meeting the description of Linda, how many of them are bank tellers, how many of them are feminist bank tellers? Another one would be degree of subjective credence or confidence on a scale of 0 to 1. How confident are you that Linda is a bank teller? And a third one is evidentiary basis. Based on the information given, how warranted is the conclusion that Linda is a bank teller? And if the ascription of irrationality to people assumes that that they're interpreting probable as in a kind of Bayesian way in which the law of conjunction applies, that is, the probability of A and B has to be less than or equal to the probability of A or the probability of B. But that isn't necessarily true if the conception of probability is warrant based on the evidence presented, in which case base rates and quantities are irrelevant. Gigerenzer claimed that if you narrow down the definition of probability and don't allow people to wonder what you had in mind, by stating it in the same problem in frequentist terms, namely you say there are 100 people, each one of them conforms to this stereotype. How many of them are feminists, how many of them are, how many of them are bank tellers, how many of them are feminist bank tellers, that the fallacy goes away. Now, as it happens, and I was, in a previous book, I cited this fact, then Danny Kahneman, one of the co-authors of that original paper on the conjunction fallacy with Amos Tversky, is also an advocate of adversarial collaboration. That is,
That's what we're doing right now.
well, that's kind of what we're doing now, yes. That is, two people who disagree have to sit down and agree on what would be an empirical test that would settle the matter, often done under the kind of arbitration or supervision of a third party who doesn't have a dog in the fight, and they a priori agree on a test that would settle it. And so Kahneman and a collaborator of Gigerenzer, Ralph Hertwig, did this. The result, as I put it in the description, the result did not settle. The wording was very clever. They said, we did not expect that the data would settle the matter once and for all, nor did this miracle occur. And I think, tell me if this is a summary, an accurate summary of this collaboration, that as Hertwig and Gigerenzer would predict, restating the Linda problem in frequentist terms made the number of fallacious answers go way, way down. On the other hand, it didn't eliminate them altogether. And there still were people who said there are more bank tellers than there are feminist bank tellers. So glass is either half empty or half full.
So let's go back for a minute to the San tribe that you mentioned. And I'm wondering whether there might be some selection bias at work here. After all, they've been doing what they're doing for 100,000 years. And they're the only ones left. So maybe they got good at something resembling Bayes' rule in distinguishing the tracks of porcupines, and I can't remember what the other animal was. But all the tribes that weren't as good at that aren't here anymore. So what really should we take from that?
Well, if that was true over a long enough evolutionary time, it would be an explanation of how we evolved to be so smart, cerebral, rational. Namely, exactly that happened. And the result would be, to the extent that this happened over generations and it selected for the genes that installed the neural circuitry that made this possible, it would say, yeah, exactly. That's why humans have a capacity for rationality.
But the San are not doing well in dealing with a non-hunter-gatherer world.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they haven't taken to, well, they have taken to alcohol in a way that's not good for them, and none of them have realized, gee, you know what Africa needs is cell phones that can be used to exchange money, right? That hasn't happened. So they are really good at the thing they've been doing for 100,000 years, and probably not so good at trading options.
Right. Well, true, but remember, we're kind of using this as the kind of baseline for a minimum that we're equipped with. To the extent, again, this is an argument that itself is sort of, can be questioned, but that they are representative of all of us if you rewind the tape far enough back. So yes, we started with those abilities and we built on them, but this is a glimpse of what we started with. And it's a higher baseline that you might have guessed if your stereotype of hunter-gatherers were they're kind of nervous rabbits always reacting to a rustle in the grass.
So let's take a problem that behavioral economists have been interested in, which is saving for retirement. That's a very new problem.
Yeah.
People have only lived long enough for that to be a problem. For 100 years, more or less. Used to be you would die, or if you happened to get lucky, move in with the family who lived nearby. So we haven't had 100,000 years or even 1,000 years or even 200 years to work on that problem. And it turns out people stink at it.
Yeah.
So if we're, as social scientists, we're trying to understand, the economic model, the one that I was reacting to when I wrote my book with the word quasi in it, economists are assuming that everybody is as smart as the smartest economist,
Right.
or possibly even as smart as the smartest economist thinks he is.
Or she.
Yes, we might agree on who I'm thinking of. So, neither of us think that is a good representative agent,
Yeah.
right? John von Neumann is not the typical human. And, you and I struggle to convince our University of Chicago and Harvard students that paying attention to sunk costs is a fallacy, or how to use Bayes' rule. So What about the rest of
Yeah.
the world?
So in the case of, say, failing, discounting the future too steeply, which would be what failing to save adequately retirement would be an example of, there are undoubtedly, this could be a case of predictable irrationality, that our intuitions were shaped by a world that is no longer applicable, that actually is a rational adaptation to that world, but that is no longer rational given the changed environment. In the case of not saving for retirement, as you said, it actually doesn't make sense to save for what you will enjoy at the age of 80 if you're not going to reach 80, nor is it rational if there aren't institutions that are going to last long enough to repay all your retirement savings. And even today, maybe if you invest your retirement with Bernie Madoff or with a Silicon Valley Bank, maybe that wasn't so rational. So what is rational depends both on your anticipated lifespan and on the predictability of the environment, that is, whether you are guaranteed to be repaid. And in a world without stable banks and long lifespans, not making that kind of sacrifice now to benefit your 80-year-old self was rational, just a different tuning of the parameters. And so it is true that we don't update to the modern, the world of modern institutions. And indeed, going back to the question of why people are unquestionably irrational. I mean, it is irrational to deny the efficacy and safety of vaccines. It's irrational to believe in homeopathy. It's irrational to believe in astrology. I think a lot of those cases are that when it comes to the world beyond our immediate experience, when it comes to questions like what's going to happen in 30 years and how can I affect it? What happened 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago? What happens on the ultra-microscopic scale? Why do some people suffer misfortune or so bad things happen to good people? What happens in the corridors of power? Who determines whether a war is started or not? We tend to think we correctly think that modern institutions provide answers to questions like that. Modern medicine and journalism and data science and history and people who look in archival records and keep data sets. Those modern institutions are very, very recent in our evolutionary history. Forget about going back to the savannah. They barely existed 200 years ago. And even today, a lot of people don't have access to them, aren't aware of them. And retirement savings that will reliably be repaid in 50 years' time is yet another example of a gift of modernity that is very recent, that we did not evolve adaptations to. So I think a lot of cases of irrationality consist of people not availing themselves of these very, very, very recent institutions that we have to consciously learn about and take advantage of, but are by no means intuitive. And that's one of the reasons I would argue that we have higher education, so you can learn about things like science and finance and data and statistics and logic, because we didn't evolve with those institutions.
So you mentioned evolutionary psychology. One of the themes in that work is that we have evolved to be good at detecting cheats. And yet there's Bernie Madoff. And even in the biological literature, there are parasitic birds. So if you don't know what that means, there are birds like cuckoos that are free riders. They've evolved to lay eggs that look like other birds' eggs, and they lay them in the correct nest and then skedaddle. And the host bird, I don't know whether it's often or mostly, doesn't notice it. So how is what should we make of
Yeah.
that, and the fact that people still are sending us emails from Nigeria about how we can help them out by sending them 10 grand.
Right. Well, in cases like that, there is a selection not to be cheated. There's also selection to cheat others. And so what you have is an evolutionary arms race where, as with the case of the nest parasites and the birds, there is a constant pressure of each party to profit from the competition, but there's no expectation that one will categorically win. So in the case of birds, one of the reasons that birds' eggs come in so many different colors and patterns of speckles and so on is that itself evolved as a defense against nest parasites. The nest parasite has to not only deposit its own egg, but make it look, let's say if it's trying to parasitize a robin, to lay blue eggs. So it ups the ante for the parasite. And maybe some parasites actually do that. I'm not enough of an ornithologist to know. But then that would perhaps up the pressure on the robins to lay eggs that had little extra squiggles or whatever. Likewise, in the case of humans and cheaters and cheater detectors, there's no guarantee that the detection of cheaters will be infallible. And in fact, the better we are at detecting cheaters, the greater the pressure it is on the exploiters to be ever cleverer. And of course, con artists can be very clever at exploiting all of the trust that we need in order to function without constantly doing due diligence for everything that a friend or a neighbor says. But it creates loopholes and cracks for the clever con artists to exploit.
So if there were bird regulators,
Yes.
They might be authenticating eggs.
That's right.
And I think there are similar ideas.
Well, in the case of humans, we can see it just in our own lifetime of using computers. The first computers we used, you just log on. Then they had to do these things called passwords.
You pressed on.
Yeah, and that was it. Now you got to type in a password. Then the password had to have digits and characters because the hackers would just feed every word in a dictionary as a potential password, and so that's why you had to put the hash marks. And then even that was defeated. So now it's two-factor authentication, and you pull out the iPhone. So we're kind of seeing this cheater and cheater detection dynamic work out in this conscious realm of computer security, and probably something plays out in our interactions where we do trust, but then some people exploit that trust, and we're kind of wary for people that might exploit that trust.
So you include in the book a couple of visual illusions, and I think you and I are both fans of those. You've all seen various forms of it. And if you've ever driven in the desert, you've seen what you'd swear is a big puddle of water, surprisingly, in the middle of the desert, and it isn't. So the visual system, you say, and I agree with, is really quite good, and the visual illusions are sort of exceptions. Is that the way you feel about the Linda's that we were talking about? Linda as a stand-in for all the things, all the judgment and decision-making and biases.
Pretty close in that and for many decades, visual illusions have been used as an analog of cognitive illusions, even the term cognitive illusion, probably. But the way to interpret that is not, well, that just shows that the visual system is a bunch of buggy, imperfect kludges and illusions. Illusions exist, but the human visual system is pretty damn good, as evidenced by the fact that we don't have self-driving cars, because they don't see as well as we see. And there's been a lot of brain power and a lot of money that goes into duplicating the functionality of the human visual system, and we're not there yet. So the human visual system is a pretty high bar. It's not perfect, it's not infallible, it couldn't be because we don't have clairvoyance. We just have processing of information, of cues that signal or portend something in the world, but it's pretty good. And likewise, probably a lot of cognition, even though you can expose it in the same way that a perceptual psychologist can expose impossible figures and two lines that are objectively the same length, but one looks longer than the other. So you can kind of pull away the veil and show the innards in perception and cognition, but you shouldn't conclude from that that cognition is this just pathetic pile of kludges and tricks. So that's the way I would, that's the glass.
So
how I describe the glass.
Our good friend Danny Kahneman describes himself as a rational pessimist.
Yes.
He says it's rational because he's never disappointed. That's a mistake because when he was worried about happens, he then worries about what next.
Despair springs eternal.
Yes. You, on the other hand, at least seem outwardly to be an optimist. So how to put this? What is a nice Jewish boy from Montreal, home of Leonard Cohen? How do you end up as an optimist?
Yes, Leonard Cohen, if you wanted darker fame. Yes, it's his last song. So I am often characterized as an optimist for the two books that I wrote that tried to document human progress quantitatively. That is, measures of human well-being like child mortality, infant mortality, maternal mortality, longevity, war, illiteracy, accidental death, violent death, sexual assault. All of those measures, when you plot them on a graph with time as the x-axis, the bad things go down and the good things go up. Not monotonically, that would be a miracle, but that's an unmistakable trend, and it's one that, and this does get to human biases and illusions and fallacies. One of the reasons that that's met with such incredulity is, I argued, the availability bias or the availability heuristic. Namely, we do intuitively assess risk and danger and probability by how easy it is to think of examples, how available they are in memory. And so everyone can think of the grisly murder, the school shooting, the horrible tragic death, the plane crash. And as long as those haven't gone to zero, there'll be plenty of them in the news. And in some cases, there may even be more of them if everyone is a reporter because they've got a cell phone camera. And so we can have the illusion that things get worse and worse, even if they get better and better, which could only be exposed by data. Again, an invention of modernity. We didn't evolve with third-party data sets. And so there's a mismatch between the real historical trends, so I argue, and people's impression of the trends. So because of that, because I showed all of these graphs of deaths in war just have gone down since 1946, even with the war in Russia, there is an uptick, but it doesn't take us back to the levels of the 80s or the 70s or the 60s. It hasn't wiped out the progress. It's something you just can't appreciate by reading the headlines because you're the victim of your own availability heuristic. That leads me to be called an optimist because, so I would argue, I'm actually accurately reporting the level of water in the glass, and the view of the world through journalism can't accurately report that.
Right. Danny looks at that glass and says it's moist.
Yes.
So we, at best, more. Many people who signed up for this submitted some questions, and let me get to some of those. One says, Stephen, in your book, you write, the arc of knowledge is a long one and it bends toward rationality. What do you think is the strongest evidence in support of that assertion? And then there's a question to me, do you think this is half true or half false?
Well, the strongest evidence would be just the objective accomplishments of our civilization, the fact that we really do live longer, that fewer babies die, fewer mothers die, fewer people starve, fewer people get felled by accidents and lightning strikes and all the rest. The fact that science progresses, that we really do understand lightning bolts as discharges of electricity as opposed to projectiles hurled by the gods, that we correctly attribute disease to pathogens rather than miasmas, and that not everyone signs on to all of these accurate beliefs, but still you have fewer people consulting entrails, fewer people seeing omens in ellipses and eclipses and rainbows. Slavery is abolished, and laws that criminalize homosexuality are abolished. Again, not monotonically, there are backtracks, but there is a huge historical trend in that direction that doesn't depend on your frame of mind. You can just count and you see that it goes in the right direction. So just many examples like that.
I won't mention the current Supreme Court. Here's a question from Ryan. In Enlightenment Now, you express skepticism that humanity will ever lose control over AI, a topic that is now on everyone's mind, or that it will have unintended harmful consequences on society. With the new advances...
I didn't say that, but yeah.
Okay, I'm just quoting Ryan.
Okay. Okay, Ryan, okay.
With the new advancements in artificial intelligence and language learning models, how rational or irrational is it to be concerned about the negative or positive impacts of AI?
Oh, it's entirely rational to be concerned with the negative impacts, as it is with any technology, because nothing has just one effect, and therefore nothing has only positive effects. What I do think is a waste of worry, and we don't have an infinite worry budget, is some of the scenarios in which the human species is extinguished by rogue AI that either seeks to dominate and does to us what we did to the passenger pigeon, or that Europeans did to many indigenous peoples of just dominating them, taking them over, nor the other doom scenario in which AI, in pursuing some goal, is oblivious to human well-being and wipes us out by accident in pursuing the goal. The prototypical example, I think it's from Nick Bostrom, of you give an AI the goal of making as many paperclips as possible, and so it uses every available atom to make more and more paperclips, including our own bodies. Or you give an AI the goal of curing cancer, and it conscripts all of humanity as involuntary guinea pigs for fatal experiments and wipes us out. I think there are a lot of things to worry about, not that, not either of those. And I explain why in Enlightenment Now. One of them is it's easy to anthropomorphize AI and to conclude from the fact that the kind of intelligence that we're most familiar with, namely human intelligence, comes bundled with traits like the urge to dominate, the thirst for power, kind of Nietzschean will to power. But that's just because we're products of natural selection, which selected both for competition and in our species for problem-solving ability. But they aren't the same thing, and there's no reason they have to come bundled together. And unless you're talking about the kind of Dr. Doom or Bond villain scenario in which someone deliberately crafts an AI to take over, but if it's simply the goal is to make a system intelligent, there's no reason why it would have to take over, maximize use of resources, see humans as rivals, or any of those scenarios. As for the kind of collateral damage scenario, to take yet another example, you give AI the goal of regulating the amount of water behind a dam, and it floods a town because it didn't take into account all the people living in the valley. These aren't cases of artificial intelligence. These are cases of artificial stupidity. Now, the whole premise that there is a system that we would build and empower, that is, connect to the grid, that pursues one goal and does not even consider the side effects, is not intelligence. Intelligence never consists of optimizing just one goal and being oblivious to everything else that happens. Intelligence is optimizing among multiple goals. And so those scenarios, I think, are self-contradictory. They assume a system that is so intelligent that it could turn flesh into paper clips, not a trivial task, or devise the experiments that will cure cancer, but at the same time so stupid that it doesn't realize that curing cancer does not mean eliminating humanity, or making paper clips doesn't mean obliterating humanity, and that the engineers who devise it are smart enough to develop an intelligence that could accomplish these amazing feats, but so stupid that it never occurred to them that it could run amok if that's all you designed it to do. So I think that while there are realistic side effects that we ought to be concerned with, such as large-scale production of disinformation, such as empowering fraud, as in deepfakes, such as potential mass unemployment, kind of real side effects, I think that too much attention has been given to these sci-fi scenarios, which I consider quite preposterous.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. One thing I would add to it is we've known for 50 years that simple statistical models are better at almost every repetitive human judgment task, and yet we're very reluctant to use it.
Probably too reluctant.
Almost certainly too reluctant.
This is an old literature that even, forget sophisticated artificial intelligence, a pretty dumb regression formula of a kind that an intro stats student would learn outperforms the human judge.
And including things like deciding whether a tumor is malignant or benign. So the last big question. What do you think best characterizes the root cause of man-made climate change? Rationality or irrationality? How does your answer influence what you would advocate as the most promising ways to deal with this problem?
Yeah. So I think it's an excellent example of how game theory should be part of the cognitive toolkit of every educated person, because I think it provides the answer to that question, at least provides my answer to that question, which is that the tragedy of climate change is that it is in the interests of every person, indeed of every country, to avail themselves of the dense, convenient energy available in fossil fuels. Namely, if I'm the only guy who forgoes air conditioning and driving my own car, I'm not going to save the planet by doing it. I'm just going to have to wait at a bus stop and get wet, or swelter in the summer, or freeze in the winter. So it's rational for me to use those fossil fuels, which are dense, cheap, compact, available, plentiful. Likewise, it doesn't make sense for any single country to impose policies that will impose higher energy costs on its people, as long as the rest of the world is not doing so, because then they suffer all the harms, but they're also not saving the planet. The problem is that it's disadvantageous for everyone if everyone consumes fossil fuels. And there's no direct way out of it if you keep those as the rules of the game. That is what's typical, is a standard game theoretic tragedy of what's rational for each agent is irrational when everyone does it. A prisoner's dilemma, a public goods game, a tragedy of the commons, and we're kind of living in a tragedy of the climate commons. The way out is to change the payoffs so that what is in the interests of each individual also is in the interests of everyone if they make the same choice. And that would be, I would argue, a combination of a carbon tax, which I think most economists would favor, so that you increase the price of dirty energy, and technological innovations that would lower the cost of clean energy. I personally think that nuclear has to be part of that mix, that people's appetite for energy is ever expanding and ought to be ever expanding, and ways of delivering the most energy at the lowest cost, including the lowest environmental cost of carbon emissions, is the way in which people acting in their own interests, that is opting for the cheapest form of energy, will also do what's good for the planet, namely not emit greenhouse gases.
So in the revision of Nudge that Cass and I wrote during the pandemic, the final edition, no matter what Cass might think, or at least the final edition with a living Thaler, we advocate something like that, and every economist agrees we need to have much higher carbon taxes. And I think there's a literature, a behavioral economics literature on things like the public goods game, that what seems to promote cooperation is the ability to punish. So I think there's sort of an outline of a plan that might work, a kind of Paris Accord with some teeth, but we would need a critical mass of countries, and they would have to include India and China. So let me end with the following quote that I saw this morning from Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, talking about the debt limit crisis. Talk about irrationality. Just having that debt limit is stupid. But here's what Jamie says, quote, "The closer you get to it, you will have panic. The other thing about markets is that always remember, panic is the one thing that scares people. They make irrational decisions." So here's the most powerful man in the financial universe who thinks that we may have some irrational behavior. Steve, thanks very much for joining us.
Richard, thank you so much. And thanks all of you. Thank you.